The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the small, cozy living room. In the quiet of their home, Andrea sat on the floor, her back leaning against the couch, as her 8-year-old daughter, Lily, giggled while carefully arranging her dolls in a circle. The warmth of the moment was palpable, a rare peace after a long day. Andrea's eyes softened, watching her little girl, her heart swelling with love. Everything felt right, too right. Andrea had learned to treasure these fleeting moments of joy. She wasn't sure when the world around her had started to spin out of control, but she knew that this was the calm before the storm. And in this calm, with the smell of fresh-baked cookies still lingering in the air, she allowed herself to forget, for just a second, that her life was unraveling. "Mommy, look!" Lily's voice pulled Andrea from her thoughts. Andrea smiled, her exhaustion melting away as she looked at her daughter's beaming face. "What is it, baby?" Lily held up a small porcelain doll, its dress a little crooked, but her eyes were filled with pride. "She's ready for her tea party, but she needs a guest. Will you join her?" Andrea's heart clenched. She always did her best to be there for Lily, to be the mother she needed her to be. But the shadows in her mind couldn't be ignored. Would I be enough? Before Andrea could respond, a loud knock on the door broke the moment. The sound sliced through the air, so abrupt, so harsh, that it made Lily's little face crumple in confusion. Andrea's smile faltered. She got up and glanced at the clock. "It's late. Who could that be?" She opened the door, and there stood a man in a crisp suit, his expression grim. "Are you Andrea Matthews?" he asked, his voice cold, almost mechanical. Andrea's heart skipped. The man didn't look like someone delivering good news. "This can't be happening. Not now." Yes, I am. Is something wrong?" Her voice trembled, even though she tried to hold it steady. "We need you to come with us. It's urgent. Urgent." Andrea's breath hitched. She looked back at Lily, whose wide eyes mirrored her mother's confusion. "What is it? What's happened?" The man's gaze softened for a brief second, then hardened again. "Your husband, George, he's been arrested." The word struck Andrea like a physical blow. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she grabbed the doorframe for support. "What do you mean? Arrested? For what?" The world around her began to blur, her mind unable to process the information. The man hesitated before speaking again, his voice lowering. "We believe your husband has been involved in serious criminal activity. It's connected to a number of troubling incidents." He glanced down at Lily. "You should sit down, ma'am. We need to talk." Andrea barely heard him. Her ears were ringing. "George? My George? No." Her mind rejected it. There had to be a mistake. George was her everything. He was Lily's father. He had always been the one who promised to protect them, to keep them safe. But this was the unthinkable. Andrea's hands shook as she closed the door slowly, stepping backward into the house. Her breath came faster. This was it. The moment her life was about to shatter. She could already feel the weight of it pressing in on her chest, suffocating her. "Mommy, what's going on?" Lily's voice, small and fearful, broke through Andrea's panic. The little girl reached for her hand. Andrea turned to her, trying to steady her breath, but the tears were already welling up in her eyes. It's okay, sweetie. Everything's going to be okay." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. Outside, the sirens began to wail, growing louder, closer, and with them came the cold, brutal truth. Her life was about to change forever, but Andrea had no idea how much worse it was about to get. As the door shut behind her, and the man from the authorities turned and walked away, Andrea's mind flashed to the one thing she had ignored for months. The signs. The subtle shifts in George's behavior, the way he started coming home late, the guarded phone calls, the unexplained absences. But she had brushed them off. She had convinced herself that everything was fine. Now, as she stood there, holding Lily's trembling hand, Andrea could only wonder. What had George really been hiding, and how much danger were they in? Her heart raced, but she steeled herself. She had to protect Lily, whatever it took, whatever this was. In the distance, Andrea could hear Lily whispering, almost to herself, "Mommy? What if Daddy's guilty?" Andrea froze. Her little girl's innocent question felt like a gut punch. Guilty? The word echoed in Andrea's mind, repeating with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. No, Andrea thought desperately. No, couldn't be true. But as the door slammed shut, and she watched the police car pull away, the truth seemed closer, more real than ever before. And that was just the beginning. Andrea Matthews had always been a devoted wife and mother. For years, her world had revolved around her family. particularly her daughter, Lily. Every morning, she would wake up early to make breakfast, pack Lily's lunch, and ensure the day started with a soft, comforting routine. They were simple moments, but they meant everything to her. As Lily laughed and played, her little arms wrapping around Andrea's neck, Andrea felt the warmth of a love that seemed unshakable, as if nothing could touch them. George Matthews, her husband, was the center of their world. He had always been the strong, steady presence in their home. He was a successful businessman, always providing for his family, and though his work often required long hours, Andrea had grown accustomed to it. She trusted him implicitly. They had built a life together, a life filled with quiet routines, shared dreams, and, above all, a sense of safety. But beneath that safety, something had begun to unravel. Andrea didn't know when it started exactly. Maybe it was the late nights, the strange phone calls, or the way George became more distant, more guarded. At first, she told herself it was nothing. After all, everyone had their own pressures. But the small changes piled up, and the doubts began to creep in. George was becoming someone she didn't quite recognize anymore. There were moments when Andrea felt a coldness from him, a shift that she couldn't explain. He would snap at her over the smallest things, his eyes avoiding hers during conversations. Sometimes he would come home, his suit smelling faintly of alcohol, as though he had been out with clients. He would lock himself away in the study for hours, and when Andrea tried to talk to him, he'd just give her a quick smile and assure her it was all just stress. But there were moments when Andrea caught glimpses of something more. A fleeting look on his face when he thought no one was watching. A harsh tone that lingered longer than it should. She had learned to push the fear away, to convince herself that everything would be fine. They had always been happy, hadn't they? Yet, as the days passed, Andrea couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She had no proof, no concrete evidence. Just the sinking feeling that her husband, the man she had trusted with everything, was hiding something. But she couldn't bring herself to confront him. Not yet. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him, of losing everything. And then, just as she began to believe that perhaps it was all in her head, the knock at the door changed everything. The sound echoed through the house, shattering the fragile calm they had maintained. Andrea's heart raced as she glanced at Lily, her little face still innocent and unaware of the storm about to descend upon them. Could it really be happening? The stakes were suddenly higher than she had ever imagined. What had George been hiding all this time? And more importantly, what did it mean for their future? For Lily's future? The path Andrea had walked for years, the one that seemed so secure and full of love, was now leading her into uncharted, terrifying territory. And as she stood there, her mind swirling with questions, the uncertainty of the future gripped her heart. Was her family truly safe? Or had she been blind to the danger lurking in the shadows all along? Andrea barely slept that night. The shadows in the room felt like they were closing in, each creak of the house seeming louder than the last. She lay in bed, her mind racing through every moment she had ever shared with George, every smile, every promise. How could he do this? The words kept spinning in her head like a haunting melody, but there was no answer, no explanation that made sense. At breakfast the next morning, Lily didn't seem to notice the tension in the air. She chattered about her upcoming school play, her face alight with excitement. Andrea smiled weakly, trying to focus on her daughter's enthusiasm, but her mind kept drifting to the police's visit, to the uncertainty of what lay ahead. She had tried to call George last night, but his phone had gone straight to voicemail. Where is he? Mommy, are you listening? Lily's voice cut through Andrea's thoughts. Of course, sweetie, Andrea said, forcing a smile, but Lily frowned. Why do you look sad? Did something happen? Andrea's heart clenched. Her daughter was so perceptive, so innocent, and yet the truth that loomed over them was far too much for her young mind to comprehend. Nothing's wrong, honey. I'm just thinking. Lily nodded slowly, her eyes not entirely convinced. Andrea hated lying to her, but she knew that in this moment, there was nothing else she could do. How could she explain the unthinkable to her child? Later that morning, Andrea received a phone call. It wasn't from George. It was from one of George's colleagues, a man named Victor, who worked alongside him at the law firm. Andrea had met him once at a dinner party, but hadn't spoken to him much since. His voice on the other end of the line was unsteady, almost nervous. Mrs. Matthews, I need to talk to you. About George. Andrea's pulse quickened. What is it? Where is he? Why hasn't he called me? There was a pause, and when Victor spoke again, his voice was low, as if afraid of being overheard. I don't know how to say this, but George is in more trouble than you realize. There are things he's been involved in that. The line went dead. Andrea blinked in confusion, her heart pounding in her chest. She immediately dialed Victor's number again, but it went straight to voicemail. Panic surged through her as she tried to make sense of the call. What was he trying to say? What kind of trouble? Just then, her phone rang again, but it wasn't Victor. It was the number of her lawyer, Michelle. Andrea's stomach dropped. The lawyer had been helping them with their finances, and she couldn't imagine why she was calling now. Mrs. Matthews? Michelle's voice was gentle, but the underlying seriousness in her tone was undeniable. I've just received some very concerning information about your husband. It's regarding his assets and a potential fraud case. Andrea felt the blood drain from her face. Fraud? What do you mean? Is this about the company he owns? I can't go into specifics yet, but there's evidence linking him to some illegal transactions. We need to meet. It's urgent. Andrea was frozen in place. No, this isn't possible. This can't be happening. George, the man she had trusted more than anyone in the world, was now entangled in something far darker than she could have ever imagined. She ended the call with Michelle and dropped her phone onto the kitchen counter. Fraud? Illegal transactions? Andrea couldn't breathe. She barely noticed Lily tugging at her sleeve until her daughter's soft voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. Mommy, what's wrong? Andrea knelt down, pulling Lily into her arms. She kissed the top of her head and whispered, I'm okay, sweetie, just a little confused. But the truth was that Andrea wasn't okay. And the worst part was that she knew something was terribly wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to confront it. The day passed in a blur. Andrea tried to distract herself with mundane tasks, folding laundry, making lunch, but it all felt like it was happening in a dream, a nightmare she couldn't wake from. In the back of her mind, she kept wondering if George was out there, hiding something, lying to her. That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Andrea found herself standing in front of the study door, her hand hovering over the knob. She hadn't entered this room in days, maybe even weeks. George had been spending more and more time in there, sometimes not coming out for hours. But tonight, something felt different. Something inside her told her that now was the time to face the truth. With a deep breath, she turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. Papers were scattered everywhere, legal documents, open files, and even some photos. As Andrea approached the desk, she saw a stack of papers with the word, Fraud Investigation, written on the top. Her heart skipped a beat. The room felt like it was closing in on her. She reached for the papers, her fingers trembling as she flipped through them. The documents detailed a complex scheme involving illegal transfers of money, false invoices, and shell companies. It was all connected to George's law firm. Andrea's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was what Victor had tried to warn her about. As she scanned the documents, one name kept appearing. Victor. Victor Johnson. Her mind raced. Was Victor involved in this too? Just then, a soft click of the door behind her made Andrea freeze. She turned, her heart hammering in her chest. George stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, George stepped forward, his gaze darkening as he took in the papers scattered across the desk. What are you doing in here, Andrea? His voice was cold, controlled, but there was something dangerous lurking beneath the surface. Andrea stood tall, her hands shaking but her resolve hardening. She wasn't going to back down now. What is this, George? What is all of this? George didn't answer immediately. His eyes flickered to the papers, and then back to her. For a long moment, the silence between them stretched out, thick and suffocating. And then, in a voice colder than Andrea had ever heard, George spoke. You should have stayed out of this, Andrea. Now you've crossed a line. Andrea's heart raced. I want the truth, George. I want to know what you've been doing, what you've been hiding from me. George's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no humor in it. You wouldn't understand, Andrea. This isn't for you. Andrea's mind reeled. What was he talking about? Before she could respond, George took a step toward her. You're out of your depth. You should leave it alone. But Andrea stood her ground, her fear giving way to something else. Anger, resolve, a determination to protect her daughter at all costs. I'm not going anywhere. Not until I know the truth. George's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Andrea thought he might lash out. But instead, he turned on his heel, leaving her standing there with the truth that had just begun to unfold. Truths that were darker and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. This was just the beginning. The courtroom was eerily silent. The air seemed thick with anticipation, and Andrea felt every second stretch longer than the last. She sat rigidly in her chair, her hands gripping the edge of the table, trying not to let her fear show. Her eyes flicked to Lily, sitting quietly beside Mary, her little face full of worry and confusion. Mary gave Andrea a reassuring smile, but the tension between them was palpable. George stood at the front of the room, his demeanor calm, collected. He was wearing his usual suit, the one that made him look more like a businessman than a man facing a serious accusation. His posture was perfect, his smile cool and composed. "This is the man who's been lying to me, the man who betrayed me," Andrea thought, her heart pounding in her chest. The judge, a stern woman with years of experience etched on her face, looked down at the paperwork in front of her. She glanced briefly at Andrea before returning her gaze to George. "Mr. Matthews," she began, her voice calm but heavy with authority. "You stand accused of fraud, embezzlement, and a series of financial crimes that have devastated your clients. How do you plead?" George's eyes gleamed with an unsettling confidence as he stood tall. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Andrea's throat tightened. She had known it wouldn't be easy, but hearing him deny everything, hearing him lie in front of everyone, felt like a slap to her face. This man is capable of anything, she thought bitterly. The room was filled with whispers as George's lawyer stood to present the defense. But Andrea didn't hear them. She wasn't paying attention to the words anymore. She was focusing on the moment that was about to come, the one thing she had been dreading and preparing for in the weeks leading up to this day. Mary had told her countless times that she needed to be strong for Lily, that this wasn't just about George's betrayal. It was about the truth, about justice for everyone he had hurt. But Andrea's mind kept slipping back to that moment in the study, the chilling look in George's eyes when he realized she knew the truth. He's done horrible things. He deserves to pay for them. Andrea's stomach turned as the judge called for a brief recess. George turned away from the front of the courtroom, making his way toward Andrea. For a moment, Andrea felt herself shrink, the power he exuded in that moment overwhelming. "I know you're scared," he said, his voice low, almost soothing. "But this isn't your fight, Andrea. You don't want to do this. Think of Lily. Think of your future." His words were like poison, slowly dripping into her ears. "He's trying to manipulate me again," she realized, "but I won't let him." Her hands clenched into fists. Before she could respond, there was a loud, unmistakable sound, the heavy slam of a door. Andrea turned quickly, her heart stopping in her chest. Lily stood in the doorway, her small frame barely visible as she peered into the courtroom. The room fell into a stunned silence. Lily was supposed to be sitting with Mary, safe and sound, far away from the confrontation. Andrea's breath caught as her daughter stepped into the room, her face flushed and her hands trembling. Without a word, she walked directly toward the stand, where the court's attention immediately shifted to her. "Lily!" Andrea's voice cracked as she tried to call out to her daughter. But Lily didn't listen. She didn't even turn around. The judge's stern voice echoed through the room. "Miss Matthews, what are you doing here? You are not permitted in this court." Lily's eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto George. The room grew so still that Andrea could almost hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Ms. Matthews," the judge repeated, her voice sharp, "if you do not leave immediately, I will have you escorted out." But Lily didn't move. Her eyes never left George, who now appeared visibly shaken by the unexpected turn of events. Slowly, Lily raised her hand, and Andrea's stomach twisted as she saw the piece of paper she was clutching. "I need to say something," Lily said, her voice trembling but strong. She stepped up to the witness stand, her small body now center stage. Every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on her. Andrea's heart raced. What is she doing? What is she going to say? Lily took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "I know my daddy is guilty," she said, her voice echoing throughout the courtroom. Gasps rippled through the room, and Andrea felt her world tilt. "What?" Lily continued, her voice steady despite the trembling of her small hands. "I overheard him talking to Mr. Victor late last night. He said they were going to get rid of all the evidence so no one could find out about the money they took. And I heard him say that he would blame Mommy if anything went wrong. He said no one would believe her, but they would believe him because he's smart and they trust him." Andrea froze. The words hit her like a physical blow. Lily heard all of this. Her mind raced, trying to process the shock. How had her daughter heard that conversation? How long has she known? The room was filled with stunned silence. The judge looked bewildered, while George's face was a mask of fury, his eyes burning with a mix of disbelief and anger. "Lily," George began, his voice cold and calculated, "you're mistaken. You don't understand what you're saying. But Lily's gaze didn't waver. No, Daddy. I heard you. I know what you did. For a brief moment, everything seemed to stop. The truth hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. George's facade was cracking. The room was in chaos now. Andrea's breath caught in her throat, and she fought to hold back tears as she looked at her daughter. Lily is so brave. My sweet girl. So much stronger than I ever realized. The judge cleared her throat, regaining control of the room. This is highly irregular, but given the circumstances, I think it's safe to say that the weight of the evidence presented has changed considerably. Mr. Matthews, we will need to discuss your involvement in these allegations more thoroughly. George's face twisted with rage. This is outrageous, he shouted, his voice rising. This is a lie. She's lying, Your Honor. She doesn't know what she's talking about. But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted, and the courtroom knew it. There was no denying it now. The truth had come to light in the most unexpected way, and George's web of lies was finally unraveling. As George's anger turned to desperation, Andrea's heart swelled with a sense of triumph. Her daughter had done the unthinkable. She had revealed the truth, and in doing so, she had taken the power back from George. The battle was far from over, but in this moment, Andrea knew one thing. She would never allow George to control her life again. Not now, not ever. This was just the beginning of their fight for justice. The courtroom was a flurry of activity. The judge quickly called for another recess, as the chaos of the revelation settled into a suffocating silence. George was escorted out by security, his face a mixture of disbelief and fury. Andrea sat motionless in her seat, the shock still numbing her senses. It felt as if the entire world had tilted on its axis, throwing everything into chaos. And yet, in that chaos, Andrea could see a sliver of hope. Lily, still standing at the witness stand, was quietly led to her mother's side. Her small hand slipped into Andrea's, as though the act of holding her tight could somehow shield them both from the storm that was coming. Andrea's throat tightened as she looked down at her daughter. The fierce bravery Lily had shown, the courage to stand up to George, to reveal the truth when the rest of them had remained silent, left Andrea breathless. My little girl, Andrea thought, her heart swelling with pride. You're the bravest person I know. But the reality of what had just happened was slowly sinking in. The tension in the air was palpable, and the murmurs of the courtroom attendees echoed like a distant storm. Andrea's mind raced as the weight of Lily's testimony began to settle in. It's over now. He can't deny it. He's done. Yet, even as the truth came to light, Andrea's heart ached for what had been lost. Mary, who had been sitting quietly throughout the entire ordeal, now stood by Andrea's side. She placed a hand on her shoulder, her touch warm and comforting. You did it, Andrea, Mary whispered, her voice full of pride and emotion. You fought for the truth, and Lily, she's a hero. Tears welled up in Andrea's eyes as she nodded, not trusting herself to speak. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about protecting Lily. It's about making sure no one, least of all George, can hurt her again. The judge returned to the bench, signaling the court to reconvene. Her voice was firm but sympathetic as she addressed the room. Given the evidence and testimony provided, we will proceed with charges against Mr. Matthews. The court will reconvene tomorrow for further proceedings. The defendant is to be held in custody until then. Andrea's breath caught in her throat. It's over. He's going to be held accountable. But even as a sense of justice began to settle over her, Andrea couldn't shake the feeling of loss that gnawed at her insides. The life she had built with George, the trust she had placed in him, it was all shattered. There was no going back to what had been. The short walk to the car felt like an eternity. Andrea's legs felt heavy, each step laden with the weight of the decision she had made. Was it the right thing to do? She wondered. But as she looked down at Lily, her doubts melted away. Her daughter had spoken up. For her. For both of them. In the car, as they drove home in the soft glow of the fading evening light, Andrea allowed herself a moment to breathe. She glanced at Lily in the rearview mirror. The little girl's face was still full of confusion, but there was a small, hesitant smile on her lips. It's going to be okay, Mommy, Lily said quietly, her voice small but reassuring. Andrea's heart fluttered. This is what matters. This is why I fought. She nodded, her voice thick with emotion. I know, baby. We're going to be okay. As they pulled into the driveway, Andrea felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief. She could finally breathe again, but the road ahead was still long. The aftermath of George's betrayal would take time to heal, and the consequences of his actions were far-reaching. But for the first time in years, Andrea felt like she could face whatever came next. In the days that followed, the weight of the truth continued to settle over Andrea like a heavy cloak. The media storm that followed the court proceedings was relentless, but she didn't care. The public attention, the whispers, the judgment. They were nothing compared to the peace she now felt knowing that she had done the right thing. There were moments of doubt, of course. Andrea found herself looking over her shoulder, wondering if George's influence still loomed over them. But as the weeks passed and the legal proceedings moved forward, she began to feel a sense of normalcy creeping back into her life. Lily, too, began to return to herself. The sparkle that had been dimmed in her eyes during the darkest days of their ordeal slowly came back. She laughed more, played more, and even started talking about school again. It was as though a weight had been lifted from her small shoulders, and the burden of fear and confusion had finally started to dissolve. But there was one thing that stayed with Andrea, the reminder of how fragile trust can be, how easily it can be shattered. The lesson of what it truly means to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost, was one she would carry with her forever. And then, one evening, as Andrea sat on the porch with Mary, the first real smile she had felt in weeks spread across her face. "I think we're going to be okay," she said, looking out over the quiet street. "We've been through the worst of it. And now we can heal." Mary's hand found Andrea's, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You've already done the hardest part," she said softly. "Now, it's time to build the future you deserve." As Andrea looked out into the fading light, she knew that the path ahead would still have its challenges. But for the first time in years, she felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. "We've made it through the storm, and I'll never let anything threaten us again." With Lily by her side and the truth finally prevailing, Andrea felt a sense of peace. She had fought for her family, for herself, and for justice. And now, in the quiet after the storm, she could finally breathe freely again. The nightmare was over. Weeks passed, and the world that Andrea had once known slowly began to settle back into something resembling normalcy. The court's decision was final. George Matthews was sentenced, and his grip over their lives was now gone. The relief Andrea felt was overwhelming, but it was quiet. No loud celebrations, no fanfare. It was the kind of peace that came after surviving a storm, when the skies cleared and the world, although scarred, began to heal. Andrea spent most of her days now in the soft comfort of her home, surrounded by the warmth of her daughter. Every corner of the house, every quiet moment, was filled with the realization that they were safe. Finally, truly safe. No more running, no more fear. There was a new kind of freedom in this, one that came not from escaping a situation, but from confronting it head-on and emerging victorious. Lily had blossomed into herself again. She laughed more freely, played without hesitation, and talked about her dreams with a new light in her eyes. Andrea couldn't help but marvel at her daughter's resilience. She had been through so much at such a young age. Far too much. But somehow Lily had come through it stronger. And now, Andrea promised herself she would never let her daughter forget how brave she had been. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch together, Andrea looked at Lily, her heart full. "Do you remember that day in the courtroom?" she asked softly. Lily nodded, her small hand resting in her mother's. "I was scared, but I knew I had to do it," she said, her voice strong, a little wiser than her years. Andrea squeezed her hand. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. You showed the world what courage really means." Lily's smile was the brightest Andrea had ever seen, and for the first time in a long time, Andrea allowed herself to bask in the peace that had been so hard-earned. "We made it through," she thought, "and we'll keep going stronger together." In the months that followed, Andrea's life gradually fell into a rhythm she had long since forgotten. She reconnected with friends, rebuilding the parts of her life that had been shattered. Mary, who had become not just a friend but a sister, continued to be a steady presence in their lives, offering the support and love that Andrea had so desperately needed during those dark days. But more than anything, Andrea focused on what she had learned. She had learned that silence was not an option when it came to the truth. She had learned that the hardest choices were often the ones that mattered most. And most of all, she had learned that family, those you protect, those who stand beside you, is worth everything. In the quiet of the evening, Andrea would sometimes sit alone in the backyard, watching the sunset, reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. She thought about George, the man she had once loved, the man who had hurt her and her daughter in ways that would never fully be understood. But she also thought about how far she had come. "I found my voice," she realized, "and in doing so, I gave Lily a chance at a life free from fear." The road ahead would never be without its challenges, but Andrea knew one thing for certain. She would never let her family fall into the darkness again. Whatever came next, they would face it together, with courage, with strength, and with the unwavering belief that love and truth could overcome anything. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the world, Andrea smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in years. We're going to be okay, she thought. We're finally going to be okay. And that was all that mattered.